Good evening. I'd like to present the author of this film, Lonely Are the Brave, of Spartacus, Exodus, Johnny Got His Gun, and numerous others, Dalton Trumbo. Mr. Trumbo?
I am sorry. I was asked to bring Johnny Got His Gun. But the only copy of the film that I have is now at the Melbourne Festival, and Cinemation, who released it, would not allow us to have a copy. And Warner Brothers, which is going to release it in 16 millimeter, would not allow us to have a copy, so we brought a substitute, which I kind of liked, and I hope you did too. I, of course, wanted particularly to bring Johnny tonight because of what's been happening on this campus, events which touch me very deeply. And so we didn't. I really am not here to give a lecture, and I think the less I say at the beginning, the more you will have to say in the course of the evening. And if that is a sufficient introduction, why don't we go?
Let's go. Do we have any questions from the audience? Right there.
The use of that truck, sweeping from back and forth in the movie, is that from the novel?
Yes. I followed the novel very closely. The novel was written by a young associate professor at the University of New Mexico. I agreed to do this picture in 1957, which was in the midst of the Blacklist, for Kirk and his company. Kirk loved it, I loved it, but they switched me to Spartacus suddenly, and a lot of things happened, and we didn't get back to it until 1962. I followed the novel quite closely, and I like to do that when one can. And the director followed the screenplay quite closely, so that the novelist was pretty well translated in this. He has another one out now called Fire on the Mountain, which I think would make a very good film too. No, the fact is that about the only thing that remains in Spartacus of the novel is, well, very little, because it's a novel of ideas rather than of characters, and all we have really left is Spartacus and Crassus and Batiatus. But you had to invent a whole field of action for them, and I had to, the Spartacus of Fast, although the Spartacus of the film was not entirely historically correct, we were 100% closer than the novel. But when you get to a novel, the thing you have to eliminate is that which is not action. And also you find that you probably have to eliminate minor characters, because in a novel you can wander at your own amusement. And at the reader's amusement, too. It's a narrative form. You tell stories. You can tell the stories of people who really are but remotely related to the plot. And it kind of gives the novel richness and flavor. You try to do it in film, and, they've got to walk. You must have action. Well, that would be a history going back to 1936, really. The Blacklist began in 1947 when the House Committee on Un-American Activities Committee summoned actually 19 men from Hollywood. 11 of them appeared before the committee. The first 10 refused to say whether they had whether they were or had ever been communists, whether they were or had ever been members of the Writers Guild. The 11th was Bertolt Brecht, who had experienced un-German committees before that time, And his testimony before the committee is marvelous because they were translating the revolutionary meaning of his poetry, and he was correcting them on their understanding of German. He became rapidly incoherent in English, and they became incoherent in any language. And the next morning he was in Switzerland, and we lost a great artist. There were other losses by the committee. The committee produced 11 convicts, 10 of them being the Hollywood 10, who served a year in jail for contempt of Congress. Only 2 of them stood trial, the other 8 relying upon the trial of the 2 to determine their convictions and sentences. And I must say that was the 82nd or 83rd Congress, it doesn't matter which. I was certainly guilty of contempt of it, and so I guess that I was justly convicted. The contempt remains to this day. The 11th convict was the chairman of the committee, who was J. Parnell Thomas, who got to a federal penitentiary on a felony charge, stealing, before the 10 got there on the misdemeanor of contempt. There were 2 friendly witnesses before the committee who did rather well. One of them was an actor, really not very successful anymore, a song and dance man. His name was George Murphy. He became a United States Senator. Another one was an actor whose career was fading, named Ronald Reagan. He became governor of California. A young freshman congressman on the committee, it was his first appearance, was a man named Richard Milhouse Nixon, who became president of the United States. So I think we were rather lucky. All we did was a year. After about, there were appeals to the courts. 2 justices died who would perhaps have ruled in our favor. In 1950, we went to jail. About 30 days after our appearance before the committee, the producers met at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City in a meeting with the bankers and the American Legion and various other groups. Those interests are purely social. And the Blacklist was established relating only to these 10 men. Well, of course, once you get 10, in Hollywood alone, by the time that the Blacklist was completed, which occurred about 1954 or 5, 244 artists, directors, writers, technicians, producers were blacklisted. 240, excuse me. And 44 of them were young men who had just got back from World War II. Some of them had married before they went. Some of them had even started families. They had all been in motion pictures or just starting their careers. By 45 and 46, they got out of uniform. By 50, most of them were blacklisted, their passports denied, and denounced as un-American. A friend of mine who was a major in the Marines, 2 friends actually, one in the Army, one in the Marines, threw his medal onto the committee, a Silver Star, as he left. And it raged for about 10 years, but it didn't touch only Hollywood. It touched the universities, the schools, the civil services. It blew the brains out of the State Department. Men now are just returning into prominence at the age of 65 or 70, into respect, public respect, who were in charge of our China policy at the time when they were sending bad news. They said, you'd better watch out, the communists are going to win. You must learn to deal with this situation. For this, they themselves were denounced. Service was one, Lattimore was another. Their careers were destroyed. It went thousands of people. And it began to die down a little with the vote of censure by the Senate of McCarthy. This is the other McCarthy. And by it has pretty well diminished. Although I think there are ways of blacklisting all the time that we don't know about. Johnny Got His Gun played here, I think, for 7 weeks. And then it went into smaller theaters. Johnny Got His Gun is not financially a successful film. I am persuaded that it may never be. It's still in release here and just opening in Europe. We opened, for example, I was in Paris. We opened to the most beautiful reviews I've ever seen. The distributor was very hopeful, but business begins to fall off very fast. Because I think in a troubled time, think of the troubles we have in this country, in all directions and in all areas, that people want to go to a movie to take a deep breath and relax, and they don't relax in Johnny, and it is impossible for it to be reviewed without mentioning its subject matter, and people who are tired, troubled, say, I just don't want to go and see that. And the word of mouth, those who like it very much, it's interesting. I've heard them say it. They say, oh, I saw it last night. It was just wonderful. My wife and I didn't move throughout, and we couldn't talk for an hour afterward. It's just marvelous. Don't see it. So that's the word of mouth we get. I comfort myself, although make no comparisons, with the original fate of The Grand Illusion, which was a dismal failure. And several years later, Renoir and another man bought it, I think, for $4,000. They got the negative. They did just a small bit of work on it, and it is what it has become. This picture is leased for only 6 more years, and then the negative will return to us. And I think that in time, it will find its place. I didn't make it to get rich anyhow. Nor actually did I make it in order to get poor. But I shall more closely approach the second objective than the first. I want to tell you that every federal prisoner gets 2 days a month off for good conduct. My conduct was superb. I served 10 months of a year sentence. Well, I know it was rather difficult because we lived in a dormitory. And that means there are about 20, well, it's like an army, really, 20 army cots. I would say 150 in one big dormitory. They're about 25 inches apart, I think. And, you come in after supper, you shower, and the place is alive with conversation, people moving from cot to cot. We had a great many bootleggers there, or rather, not bootleggers, but moonshiners. Men who, whose whole lives had been spent on 7 acres of scrawny soil and growing corn, which they made into whiskey. And which is practically what the distilleries were doing too. But for some reason, the distilleries don't raise the corn. And therefore, it's a crime to make out of your own corn your own whiskey. They were illiterate, a good many of them. I spent a great deal of time writing letters for them and then reading to them the letters that were written back. I would write the letter, and then on the other end, there would be a schoolgirl in the family who would write the letter for her mother, who could neither read nor write. So actually, it would be a young daughter of the family, and I, or a son. And I found it a nice experience, but I didn't get much work done. I did one screenplay, which wasn't much good, and I sold it later on, and the picture wasn't much good, and that's about all. Yeah.
Was any short coming at all to Johnny Got His Gun? It would seem that the audience is as attracted to those that didn't have to.
Well, someone said that to me once, and I think I replied that the church has been in business for 2,000 years, and generally they preach to the convinced, and they find it a very profitable enterprise. Actually, what I mean is I do not think it is harmful. There is no reason why, because one is convinced that one can't enjoy witnessing another's conviction, you know. Well, well, I don't know. I don't think Paths of Glory had any effect at all. I know it had no effect in France because it hasn't been shown there yet. At least Johnny has been released in France. I don't think it had a significant effect. But there was no way I could have made Johnny into anything but what it is. I would have had to take another subject, you know. And I wasn't troubled about the limitation of its audience. Because if you begin to worry about the size of the audience, I mean in the best way, that is, you want it to reach as many people as possible. If you begin to change it and to play with it, with that purpose in view, often you end up with, you know, a bastard child. Yeah. Possibly. Yeah, well, that's true. But on the other hand, you see, many people who didn't see it, I'm sure, are as convinced as many people who did. There are certain times when you can't see a picture like Johnny. I got a letter from the head of the chapter of the Vietnam veterans in Seattle, and he said he had also been wounded. He said, I went to see it, and I must tell you that if I had not had my girl with me, a girl whom I love a great deal, to help me through certain portions of it, just the fact that she was there helped me, I don't think I could have stood it. And he said, we are telling some of our people, don't go to see this picture, particularly our wounded people, unless you go with someone who loves you and whom you love. Well, that's a handicap to a picture. Yet, maybe it's not bad. I just don't know. No, I know you weren't saying what I seemed to imply. Forgive me, I didn't mean to. You know, I didn't hear you.
What made you decide to stay in this country?
Well, you know, I had no part in the decision. The government took away my passport. I got it back in 1960. I got it back just in time to go to Israel for the shooting of Exodus. By that time, well, I actually, you see, I did go to Mexico. My family lived there for 2 years because you couldn't go there without a passport. And we found that we wanted to come back. We wanted to come back because what we read was happening in the United States was really more frightening to read it there than to be back and in the midst of it. And we were very glad we came back and never had any desire to leave again, although I had a long dispute with the passport office, but that's natural.
I have two questions. One is, I was very worried about the horse. I hate
The horse was never hurt. The horse, I'm sure, is still alive, if you're thinking in real terms.
Another thing, I was just wondering why you didn't fight. I didn't know anything about your history, what you're telling me.
Why didn't what?
Why you didn't fight? In other words, you just submitted to all the punishment. You're not fighting back. Now, under the Constitution, you have certain rights. Why didn't you fight back?
Well, I'll tell you. Do you know anything of the history of this period?
Well, I'm becoming acquainted now.
Yeah, well, when you discover it, you will. For example, Harper and Row was publishing a volume of the things that I wrote in that period. I wrote pamphlets. I wrote articles in The Nation. I made speeches from one end of the country to the other. I was probably, could be considered as active as anyone is today. I think why you don't fight back is a question that ought to be addressed, from a knowledge of the facts. Because your question appalls me. I spent 13 years doing nothing but fight. And that's true of many others. If you mean why did we not win, it's another matter. Is that what you meant? I'll bet that's what you meant. Well, they whipped us. Pardon? What power do you have when you can't work, when you can't get out of the country, when you have no... Are you advocating that I become a radical? Well, I'm sure that you are engaged in fight right now, aren't you? Then you just keep at it. Very good, very good. I hope you win. That's right. It's a leaky boat, but use it. Yeah, true.
But it's something that you got to force yourself to sit through. These people, they don't want to sit through a movie. But the horror that goes on in Vietnam, they would like to sit back and not have to turn on their television set. Mm-hmm. They just want somebody else to do the night and know what's going on.
Yeah.
I'm glad these people that don't want to sit through, they can force themselves to sit through. There's some movies that aren't for entertainment. There's some movies that you gotta look through, you gotta absorb them, and you gotta understand them, because you do that, and you feel like I felt with the book. I didn't see the movie yet, but I hoped to. Like I felt with the book, and I felt like this was definitely not for me.
Yeah.
And you got to force it. I'm glad you really glad. I think what you did as far as writing is going to leave a lot greater impact to George Murphy and all when people are back.
Well, the book, I do get letters that sometimes say what you have said, and of course it gives me a very good feeling. And I get many letters who say, it was difficult for me to read it, I had to put it down. I think it's good that they can put it down. They can't put a movie down, you're in there. In the last 2 years, Bantam told me the other day, they have printed 1,165,000 copies of Johnny, which means, I think, primarily that young people are reading it. And of course, that's a very heartwarming thing. If the old people are reading it, I don't think so, but if the old people are reading it, it's a discouraging thought.
What makes a good movie director?
Well, perhaps you should address one more experienced than I, that question. I don't know. I presume a sense of dramatic organization. Pulling the whole thing together and being able to keep the whole in view while you're in the midst of a scene. I think the mark of a bad director, and I have seen it, is he's in a scene, he's having difficulties with it, and then he says, we'll change it. let's change it. He's so deeply absorbed in that scene, which is going to take 5 hours today, that he forgets the changes he has made are going to influence a scene 30 pages ahead, and also mix up a scene that was 12 days ago shot. He's forgotten the whole and concentrated on the single problem. He has to be rather cool. I think that he has to be considerate. But there are highly inconsiderate directors who do magnificent work. Like everything else, I guess there is no type or rule for it. I think he has to like it, though. I think that is the thing. And have some skill.
Some.
I would like to ask, what's your ministry right now? What you're doing right now? Also, if you care to reveal it, what your astrological sign?
The Sagittarius. About 11 years ago, I began a novel and was compelled to drop it. I did 4 chapters. This winter, I returned to it because it's a subject that I'm passionately interested in. And did 6 chapters more and an outline. And it'll be published as soon as I finish it. It is the autobiography of a 72-year-old German who served in World War I, in the Free Corps, in the SA, in the SS, and his last assignment had been as a major at Auschwitz. And it's his justification of his life, why he did it, what it cost him, his sufferings, a detestable man. And I'll have it finished in less than a year. In the meanwhile, I find movies, if I'm doing a novel, a relaxing thing, and I'm doing a very fast melodrama from a book just published called The Osterman Weekend, which moves, and is all action, and it's such a pleasure to leave this desiccated old Nazi and get into something healthy. The two sort of help me. Well, it's a very difficult question, and let me explain to you why. Motion pictures being what they are, a commercial venture, work in film for the finest director being dependent as it is upon a certain number of profitable pictures. I remember when Truffaut couldn't get a penny, took $3,000 from $300,000 from an Italian distributor just in order to get some money to live on, and did a picture. It happens all the time. I think that, well, I was very pleased with David Miller on this picture. I thought he was a superb director. I liked Otto Preminger on Exodus, although I wanted to cut and he refused to cut. Stanley Kubrick was not quite the right man for this relation, not in any way to his talent, but to the circumstances in which he worked on Spartacus. He was unhappy, but he had just, again, it was a question of a young man, a director, and his career was at stake, because he had just been fired from One-Armed Jacks, the Brando picture, and Brando took it over, which is a cruel thing to do to a director. At the same time that Kirk was firing our director, Tony Mann. And it wasn't timed, but I'm sure Stanley jumped into Spartacus when Kirk offered it to him, naturally based on Paths of Glory. I'm sure he jumped into it without even reading it. As a matter of fact, I know he did, because he was a little mystified for the first 3 or 4 days. But you see, there aren't, and it's a sad thing to say, there aren't many pictures. When you look at them now, if you've done them for 35 or 40 years almost, there aren't many of them that you're really fond of. There aren't many of them that you're not fond of that you can really blame on the director or entirely on yourself. This may sound like a sad confession. It doesn't sadden me at all. It's quite normal. But I have seen pictures that I thought were badly directed. I may suggest to you one of the most frightful cinematic abortions of recent history called, the name always tries to slip my mind, The Sandpiper. And I thought we had a pretty good script. Midway through the picture, I began to howl like a wounded Comanche. To be chauvinist, I apologize for that. It's my grandfather's speech popping up in me. And I refused to go to the preview because I said, I don't like ugly surprises, and this is going to be one of the ugliest surprises you ever saw. And that, I think, was the director yielding entirely to the two actors, and that nothing could destroy a picture so quickly as that. Notice I didn't even mention the Sandpiper to you. No, I was quite active in raising the money, but I didn't produce it because I don't know anything about that end of the business, and
I'm sorry, I'm not knowledgeable, but
yeah.
It turned out to be a good film.
Well, I don't know. It's not going to make any money. We won the International Critics Prize at Cannes. We won the Grand Prix Special of the jury at Cannes. We won the Protestant Prize at Cannes. We won the Best of Festival at the Atlanta International Film Festival. We won the Peace Award there. We won the Audience Award at the Belgrade Festival. We won the Tech Artists, Directors, Writers, and Technicians Award at Belgrade. We were at invitational showings at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Toronto Film Center and at the San Francisco Film Festival. It's now at Melbourne. It's going to Rotterdam, and it has nothing but prizes and no money.
People in the industry during the 50s, there must have been some key positions who were sympathetic to you. And also, did you work during the 50s?
I worked steadily during the 50s, yes. What happened was that actually people in key parts, no matter how sympathetic they were, could not do anything. The studios themselves were in the grip of an absolute blacklist, watched so closely that I kept phony bank accounts. Because if a check had come from me during that period, from Warner Brothers, it would have been known instantly, and someone would have said to Warner, look, what do you think you're doing? We fell from whatever position we had formerly held into a market of very inexpensive pictures made by producers of inexpensive pictures. The King brothers, for example, I worked for them for quite a while. You worked for a very low salary. You used a pseudonym. I had 13 pseudonyms. But these rarely appeared on the picture because it wasn't their purpose to serve as a name on the picture. The producer's obligation was to get living people to put their names on what you did. But if I wanted to call Frank King in the middle of the day, and if he had 4 people in his office, I could say, what was my name there? Abbott, Doc Abbott. The secretary would say, Doc Abbott's on the wire. We could discuss the movie right in front of whoever was in his office. And similarly, he could call me. So that was the value of a pseudonym. You could get instantly in touch with your producer without embarrassment. Then he selected names to go on the pictures. Always, yes. Yes. Screenplays, pamphlets, and speeches, both sides of the bed.
What's your background for your book that you're writing now?
Well, it's Nazi Germany. It's Germany from... Not a bit. No more than I had for Johnny. I mean, one puts oneself in a character, or at least I do. I have no background. Of course, I've been to Germany, but that's no background at all. I have lived through the period. I have a very large library on it. I've mopped it up for years. waiting for the time when I would begin it. And, but it will be an act of the imagination, because I have to become this Nazi. And I'm horrified to tell you that I'm getting very close to the heart of him, and it's doing my psyche no good.
You had a writer who became the victim of a witch hunt for your, shall we say, not conforming to you, because you stood up for hate to see them. Could you give us your opinion regarding the treatment of some Russian writers like Pasternack and by the Soviet government who are called non-conformist in their context? If you could draw a parallel between their fate and you.
I think poison is poison. There's no way to sweeten poison. I do think that Pasternack was probably profoundly embarrassed by an outcry that went up in certain intellectual circles in his personal behalf at a time when he didn't need it. He really didn't need it, and it hurt him. Let me give you an example. While I was in jail on New Year's Day, I received a telegram from the Soviet Union congratulating me on my struggle for peace. Well, I didn't know it was a struggle for peace. And this and that and the other thing, and signed by Konstantin Simonov and one of the Tolstoys, and Fadeev, who later shot himself, and about 18 or 20 of these writers. And I thought, as I think Pasternack must have felt, Jesus, why me? You know, the FBI has got it. It's come by cable. The guard is smiling like a child. He answered to me. Happy New Year, he said. Your friends. But of course, there is less of it, but there should be none of it, and we'll have to stop. It's no good. Yes. Just about everything that you can imagine. Writing, speaking, organizing. I was defending Harry Bridges for one thing. They tried for 7 years. Put him in jail. They had him under a 5-year prison sentence. And just everything that came along, you know.
Is this similar with other people that have blackness as it grew, or was it just anyone that was sympathetic to someone who was on blackness?
Well, later it spread to associates, to friends, to less active people, as any intimidating thing does. And it spread to many people who, by definition, I presume, should not have been blacklisted. But you know, there is nothing less discriminate than a blacklist. It spreads. It's like having the measles or leprosy. Better description.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions, okay? So we'll take 2. Why don't we take one from up there?
Well, in theory, I should be. There are other film industries are subsidized by the government under arts programs. In fact, I shudder at when I think of it, because I can see, you know, 6 imbeciles in the House of Representatives, and there are far more than 6. Getting, you know, suddenly investigating why did they make this picture, which had to do, for God's sake, with adultery. Is that a good American pastime? Adultery? And the government puts its money into it, subsidizing adultery? I can hear the speeches. And it terrifies me. Some way there should be some subsidy, but you always, when you take the money, you have a danger. Now, the studios are also dangerous, and you take their money. The problem is we all have to have the money, and the movies are the most expensive form of art in existence, and there is no one connected with film who is not in some way censored, self-censored, influenced, damaged in one way or other by money. Because that's you have to have it in order to work. Your pictures must make money, most of them. And that's all over the world. That is in the Soviet Union. I don't know about China. Nixon may have a plan developed there.
Okay, right there.
Well, you see, I had read about 1932 of the death of a British major. He had been wounded in 1917, I believe, had been in a hospital ever since. They had reported him missing in action to his family. When he finally died, they informed his family that he was not, in fact, missing in action, that he had been in this hospital and had just died, and that the reason they had not notified the family was that he could not conceivably be aware of their presence if they visited him, and they could not conceivably want to see him in that condition. Well, that gave me the thought. About a year and a half later, the Prince of Wales was touring in Canada and visiting veterans' hospitals. These are young Canadians, no longer quite so young, who had been there since 1918, 19, 18 at the very latest. It was 33 or 34. And at the end of a corridor, there was a door which said no admittance. He asked to be admitted. They suggested to him that he not enter. He insisted, being the Prince of Wales. They let him in. As he came out, the journalist reported that he was weeping, and they asked him why. And he said, I saw a man there so horribly mutilated that the only way I could communicate with him was by tapping him on his forehead. And that gave me another thought. And that's just as far as it went. The rest, of course, large parts of it were autobiographical. When I flashed back to his life, I flashed back to a life I knew, which is why I never didn't update the film. I can't flash back to the life of a young man whose youth was spent just before Vietnam, because I don't know that youth. I don't know how he talks. I don't know anything about it. So I just imagined myself in the man's situation, and that's what came out. Well, take as long as you've got the hall.
Okay, well, we stay for a little while longer.
Well, as long
All right,
as you
we'll
wish.
take a few more. All right, right there.
I was wondering, since you wrote Johnny before World War II, I was wondering if that more changed your mind in any way. So the novel is extremely pacifist.
I know it. Well, it's a curious thing. I don't think there have ever been more than 10 minutes of consistency in my life, because it's so hard to be consistent, which means unchanging. I am unhappy to say that I was quite opposed to this country's entrance into World War II. Now, but I'm not unhappy to say it, because there were clearly moments when the whole Western powers were strengthening Hitler. They were building Hitler. There was an Anglo-German naval treaty in, I think, 1936, which enormously strengthened Hitler. There was a French Nazi rapprochement. There was an English-Italian rapprochement. The whole object of Western policy was to build Hitler and turn him east. The German generals themselves, when Hitler marched into the Saar, and again when he marched into Austria, the German generals signaled the British, if you'll stand by, we'll throw him out. The British had no reply. My opposition was based largely on things like that I didn't trust the West any more than I trusted Hitler. I had no particular occasion at that time to mistrust the East, which is to say Russia, because Russia had not yet been tested. And so then came the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which I think was the direct and monstrous result of Munich, which was the direct and monstrous result, and so on. When the war came, what can you do? How can you? Oh, I felt that I had to support this war. I don't mean the war would have failed for lack of my support, but that I wanted us to win it. After all, Europe was burning, and we know. And out of that came the horror that is that I am trying to capture in the novel I'm writing now. But I've shifted and changed events. If I were a North Vietnamese, do you think I'd be a pacifist? How could one be? It's tough.
Have you ever had occasion to translate a stage play into a screenplay?
Once years ago, I did Bill of Divorcement, a remake of Bill of Divorcement. But I've refused ever since because it's not very interesting.
Can you tell us something about the special problems of translating one medium to another?
Well, in my principal experience has been, of course, novel to screenplay. And the difference is this, that they, I think you said translating, I think it's almost transposing, transforming, really. Because a novel is narrative, and the film is drama, and they are really two totally different things. And you can't adapt a novel to film, generally. You must transform it into film, which means you must rely much more on action. And I don't mean only physical jump-around action. The movement, the steady movement of the intellectual movement, if you will, the tension has to be there all the time in a way that it doesn't have to be in a novel. You can't wander very often, although there are marvelous exceptions, as there are to all rules. You must think of tension, conflict, forward movement, and drama. And in the novel, you don't really bother too much about those. It comes out, sort of like a river. And a screenplay has to come, in some way, resemble a knife. That's a very bad comparison. And you think at once of Knife in the Water, and that's the perfect cinema. Which is a very good film, incidentally. Do you like it?
Yeah.
Lovely.
Okay, one more. We have time for one more. Last question.
The role of Jack Bird seemed to fit Kirk Douglas like the glove. How did you find working with Kirk? It's one of his best movies, I believe.
Well, I found working with Kirk just fine, because I wasn't on location with Lonely the Brave. I was in New York working, and David Miller was holding Kirk in, because Kirk has an enormous amount of energy. He's no fool, and the result is that and when he's the producer also, in effect, it's his company, is pretty formidable task for a director to control him. I don't mean that he would be uncontrolled in a ridiculous way, but just that creative energy going. He would call me in New York, Eddie Lewis, who was producing the film, really, and David and I had a pact, no changes. Kirk would call me. I would get a call late at night. He said, Gina and I, we were rehearsrsing last night on this scene. We found some pretty cute stuff, and we just thought, Kirk Kent is not cute. But he didn't mean cute. He meant funny, a little amusing. He's not very amusing. His forte is power and force. And I'd say, now, Kirk, just remember, you're Gary Cooper. You're lazy. You just move slow, kind of like that. And when you get up in the morning, take 2 Seconals and go out there on the set. And it'll be just fine. And it worked. I don't know that was the decisive thing.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mr. Trumbo.